I'm going to start on time just so members get a fair time with the minister. So open the meeting. Good morning and welcome to the 66th meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. This meeting is being televised pursuant to our mandate Standing Order 108, subsection 3, subsection A, subsection 3 little i's, which provides the review of the standing orders, procedure and practice in the House and its committees. We have with us today Honourable Bardish Chagger, Leader of the Government in the House of Commons. The committee members will remember that we agreed on May 18 to invite Ms. Chagger to meet with us to discuss potential changes to the standing orders as outlined in her April 30 letter to the House leaders of the official opposition in the NDP. Thank you very much for coming, Minister. Really appreciate you. I know it's very busy at the end of the year here, and we appreciate your time. So open it for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to all members of this committee for asking me to appear before you today. En tant que membre de ce comité, vous assumez une responsabilité.
As members of this committee, you have a unique and important responsibility with regards to how the House of Commons conducts its work. It is clear to me that all of you have a genuine interest in ensuring members of Parliament are able to represent their constituents as well and do the job they were sent here to do.
For the commitment you have shown, and I respect you all for the work that you do on this committee. I am pleased to be here to provide an overview of the changes of our government's that our government proposes to the standing orders and to answer your questions. As background, I would like to remind members of the committee of some of the key steps that brought us here. 2 years ago, as Canadians were preparing to cast their ballot in the general election, the Liberal Party released its campaign platform. That platform promised real change and pledged to give Canadians a voice in Ottawa. The platform said, and I quote, "For Parliament to work best, its members must be free to do what they have been elected to do, represent their communities, and hold the government to account. Government must always stay focused on serving Canadians and solving their problems." Among the specific promises that were made in the platform, introduce a Prime Minister's question period to improve the level of direct accountability, end the improper use of prorogation and omnibus bills, provide better parliamentary oversight of taxpayer dollars, strengthen parliamentary committees so that parliamentary secretaries do not have a vote on committees. On October 19, 2015, Canadians went to the polls and made their decision on the type of government and the type of parliament they wanted in Ottawa. The result was clear. Canadians elected a government with a mandate to strengthen Parliament. The Prime Minister is committed to making that happen. It is important to note the instructions he has given me in my mandate letter. The letter says, and I quote, "As Leader of the Government in the House of Commons, your overarching goal will be to make Parliament relevant again and to ensure that Canadians once again have a real voice in Ottawa. Parliamentarians must have the information and the freedom to do their most important jobs, represent their constituents, and hold the government to account. It is your job to help empower all members of Parliament to fulfill these essential responsibilities." Mr. Chair, as we move forward, I would like to stress that this is our main goal. Notre intention consiste à donner plus de pouvoir.
Our intent is to make members of Parliament on both sides of the aisle stronger. We want to give them the tools they need to do their job.
And members of Cabinet are held to greater account in the House of Commons, not less. This spring, I released a discussion paper in good faith to foster a dialogue on additional ways that we could modernize the operations of the House of Commons. I had sincerely hoped we could all participate in a conversation on behalf of Canadians about how to improve the place where we work. That did not happen, and I regret that. Members expressed heartfelt and legitimate views and concerns about some of the ideas in the discussion paper. Those disagreements had an impact on the work of the House and indeed of this committee. As you know, because the political will did not exist in the House of Commons to proceed with that dialogue on modernization, I informed my Conservative and NDP counterparts that we would not be moving forward with many of the ideas in the discussion paper at the present time. However, there are some changes that we committed to Canadians to making. They involve implementing the specific platform commitments that I mentioned earlier. All of these changes will strengthen the House of Commons and make the government more accountable. I have always been committed to a dialogue amongst House leaders about charting a path forward on these ideas. In recent days, I have been pleased by the constructive dialogue I have had with my Conservative and NDP counterparts on this issue. We have worked together collaboratively in the spirit of what's in the best interest of Parliament and our country. Now, Canadians expect us to act. Our government will soon come forward with specifics on our approach on how to make the House of Commons a better place. I would like to provide a brief overview of what to expect. Prime Minister's question period. Our Prime Minister is firmly committed to being more accessible to all members of Parliament in question period. Our proposal to introduce a PMQP would significantly enhance parliamentary accountability of the Prime Minister. Here's what it would mean. When the Prime Minister attends question period on Wednesday, he would answer all of the questions that day. This special question period would be in addition to the other days of the week when he attends the regular question period to answer questions with his cabinet ministers. Already, our Prime Minister has shown he is committed to this reform. He has attended 6 special question periods on Wednesdays, answering a total of 233 questions from MPs on those 6 days alone. Prorogation. The prorogation of Parliament signifies the end of a session and can occur with justification during a mandate. But there have been times that governments have improperly prorogued early to avoid politically difficult situations. If that happens again in the future, Canadians deserve a formal explanation in Parliament. We would like to build accountability into the process and force the government to justify its decision and let the House pass judgment on it. Omnibus legislation. Our government is committed to ending the improper use of omnibus legislation. I am not speaking here of responsibly drafted budget implementation bills that contain changes stemming directly from the budget. Rather, I am referring to what should happen when a government introduces a non-budget omnibus bill that contains entirely separate and unrelated themes. We want to ensure that MPs are not forced to vote against some things they believe in as they cast their vote on a bill. We want flexibility for MPs in these instances. Prévision budgétaire. Les députés sont chargés.
Estimates. Members of Parliament are responsible for keeping track of how the government intends to spend money. And yet, the financial accounting system that they are expected to use is inconsistent and unclear. We need a better way. We want to better align the budget and estimates process so that the data means something and is truly relevant and timely for members.
Our government believes strongly that committees provide the backbone of much of the work that is done in Parliament. It is there that MPs can do some of their best work, scrutinizing legislation and hearing the views of experts, stakeholders, and Canadians at large. Indeed, it is at the committee stage where proposed legislation can be improved, and members from all parties can constructively work together towards that end. We believe there is a role for parliamentary secretaries to be members of committees, but we also believe those parliamentary secretaries should not have the right to vote on committees or move motions. In summary, Mr. Chair, our proposals all stem from promises we made in the last campaign to improve Parliament. Canadians gave us a green light to move forward. They are waiting for all of us to make the reforms they want, and I believe that we can work together to make that happen. With that, I'd be pleased to take any questions.
Merci, Madame Ministre. Now we'll go to a 7-minute round, and we'll start with Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I have one question on one particular issue, and thank you for explaining what was in your mandate letter, but I'm going to veer away from the mandate letter for just a moment because you and I had a few discussions about what was your discussion paper, my motion here, and in that, before I became the skunk in the room when it comes to the filibuster, but that's fine. That's all part of debate. But there was one element of that discussion paper that at first blush I thought to myself, I don't think we should go there. I had a chance to go to the United Kingdom, and I spoke to a woman by the name of Margaret Best. And she was actually she was the House leader for Tony Blair. And she was the one that brought in the idea of government programming, which at first some people might say, well, that's just time allocation in disguise, or as they call it, a guillotine in disguise. But I said to her, now, did you bring this in because Tony Blair thought that this was the right thing to do? And she said, no, I did it because Margaret Thatcher convinced me this was the right thing to do. She had a bill about poverty reduction, and it got guillotined just before she got her best points out there during the course of debate. Since she brought it in, there have been several governments since, several leaders since, and each and every one, and they set up a committee to review it. There are problems with it, but yet they all accepted it. I spoke to the Liberal Democrats, they accepted it. The Labour Party accepted it, Conservatives. It'd be interesting now what happens. They're back in a minority. But even when they had the Conservative minority with the Liberal Democrats, they still accepted this idea of government programming because it does two things. It allows people to see what the debate is about. It provides transparency without doing time allocation, and they can see how it will unfold. But it also allows the government to be efficient in putting its mandate through legislation. Okay, that's a long question. But I would like to get your comments on that, on government programming, and how you feel about that vis-a-vis time allocation.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Thank you for the fruitful debate that you had here. I believe that these are some ideas, and that's why I released a discussion paper. It was in good faith to have some of these conversations. I do believe that Parliament and the House of Commons can be modernized, and that's why I want to throw some ideas there so that you could actually go and research other models. My goal as the government House leader is to ensure that we are having meaningful debate as well as advancing the mandate Canadians gave us. I do think it's important that members of Parliament be able to represent their constituents and have their voices heard, and that's why a Made in Canada model would be the best solution, I believe. It would allow us to do the important work we do in the House of Commons, as well as to continue doing the other important work we do here in Ottawa, as well as in our constituencies. I know any day of the week, as much as I am physically present in Ottawa, my heart and my mind is in my riding with my constituents, listening to their challenges that they are facing to ensure that I am doing my best to respond to them. And I have no doubt that every member is here to act in the best interest of their constituents, the people they represent. So I believe that it's a conversation that the committee could undergo and take on. I believe it's a worthy conversation to have to ensure that it works for our Parliament, our House of Commons. And I would encourage members to continue that conversation when they're ready. I took an attempt at it and I did not succeed, and I'm okay with that. But I know that the conversations have continued, and I encourage them to do so.
So during the course of the filibuster, there was quite a bit of debate, some from here, but primarily over there. And I've said before, and I mean this sincerely, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of good, and many of the members here, actually all the members here, brought in some very good input to this. Did you have a look at that debate and look at it and say to yourself, that's maybe a good idea, maybe that's a bad idea? But despite the fact that we didn't, I think the biggest problem was we didn't get witnesses to come in, like Ms. Bess, who was willing to come here. She told me verbally she would come here to talk about this. That was unfortunate. But did you have a look at some of the deliberations at that and say, and take some advice from that, or not?
Not only did I look at it, I'm just cool like that. I listened to it when I would not be on Parliament Hill. It was an important debate to have. There was a lot of great constructive feedback within that within that time. I know we refer to it as a filibuster, but I know that members were sharing perspectives and viewpoints that need to be heard. And it was unfortunate that that was the only way to do that. The work that committees do is essential to the process because committees are able to scrutinize legislation. They are able to bring in witnesses, stakeholders, and ask tough questions to ensure that we're making good decisions in the best interest of Canadians. So yes, to answer your question quickly, I did observe that debate, and I believe it was an important debate.
You informally participated at one point, so there you go. Let me just touch. How much time do I have?
Minute and a half.
Okay. I want to touch briefly on the mandate letter that you spoke about earlier. And I think one of the two elements that I think were misunderstood by the public primarily because they were misused in the last Parliament, and that is regarding omnibus legislation in particular. Prorogation, yes, but I'm more interested in the omnibus legislation piece of it. I just want to get your thoughts on how you see how governments would handle the idea of being accused of having omnibus legislation in the future, and how the Speaker can deal with that.
So what we are proposing is that the government of the day can always introduce what the government wants to. What's tough is when members of Parliament have viewpoints in certain areas and they are, there's a certain issue that is stuck into another bill that perhaps does not belong, hence why we're suggesting themes, and then being able to give the Speaker the ability to divide out votes so that if there are an area that you do not believe, members do not believe matches, the Speaker will have the ability to be able to divide out votes. No different than the Speaker is able to now. They can pair votes as well on themes, and so to provide the Speaker that ability. Also to be able to provide the Speaker the ability to have the legislation not only go to one committee, but to have other committees also study that legislation.
So you think that from a thematic approach, that's how we can deal with omnibus, in particular the Speaker can deal with that, and that's how you envision it?
No, she doesn't
That would be the approach that I would be encouraging us to advance, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sims. Now I'll officially recognize Thursday Bow Tie Day and Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Yeah, it's something that got started by guys on your side, actually. Greg Fergus was the originator of this practice. Excellent practice, may I say. I encourage my colleagues of all partisan stripes and also Paisleys and whatever else to do this.
By convention, not by
That's right. I wonder if I could just start. First of all, welcome, Minister. Glad to have you here. I wonder if I could just start by giving notice of a motion. The motion is that in relation to its consideration of the proposed appointment of Charles Robert to be Clerk of the House of Commons, the committee invite former Clerks of the House of Commons, Robert Marleau and Audrey O'Brien, to appear in order to gain a better understanding of the role, duties, and responsibilities of the Clerk of the House of Commons. So that's a notice of motion. Minister, just if I could turn to the proposed appointment of Mr. Robert as the Clerk of the House. Do you think it's reasonable that we should hear from these two former clerks prior to making this appointment?
So just as I told you last night, Mr. Reid, this isn't on the topic of today. You were asked on the standing orders, but the witness, if they want, they could answer questions outside the reason you were called here, but you don't have to because you weren't prepared for that.
I'll take a moment to say that when appointments such as this, candidates are nominated, I believe it's important that the committee be able to bring the witness in. The other work that the committee does, it is the prerogative of the committee.
So you'd have no objection to us having the two former clerks here prior to actually making a recommendation apropos of the proposed appointment of Mr. Robert?
I believe that's the work of the committee.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope we'll get consent from other members of the committee to bring in these two former clerks. Sorry. Yeah. That's actually a message for the rest of the committee members. I'll be asking them for their consent on this point. But please go ahead.
I was just going to, I'm not sure if you are aware, but prior to initiating this process, I believe it was in September, I had sent a letter to the opposition House leaders as well as to the Bloc and the Green Party, Ms. May, to ask them what they thought were important to have within a clerk, to hear qualifications, experiences, and so forth. That was a letter that I believe was well received and responded to. So these are conversations that have partook, not at the committee table, but I did initiate that conversation and I did receive responses, just for the record.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think perhaps we could also make the request then of the various House leaders, if they're willing to share the responses they gave to, we can add that to the mix. That would be very reasonable. I can't really ask you to provide those to us because, of course, those were presumably sent back to you confidentially, and that would be putting you in an awkward position. But we'll make that request to the various House leaders. I just wanted to deal with something you said in your comments today, the theme you expressed. You said Canadians elected a Liberal government with a mandate to strengthen Parliament. That's a direct quote from you. And I'm not in a position to dispute the accuracy of that, but I am in a position to say that when it comes to the appointment process, your government has been failing at this, failing very, very badly. The example of Madame Mayer and the way in which consultation, consultation which is legally required, was handled is the paradigm example here. It was, in fact, after the fact consultation. It was actually notification. It was advance notification. So before the House gets to find out, the leaders of their parties get to learn what decision has been made, which is not the same thing as consultation. Consultation involves the ability to say no. With regard to Charles Robert's proposed appointment, something very similar has occurred. He has been presented to us in the dying days of this Parliament, and we have had a meeting, which, of course, as soon as you leave, he comes in, we meet with him, foisted upon us so quickly that we have had no opportunity to do proper research to determine the right kinds of background information that would be helpful. And this has been an enormous frustration. I told the chair that I did not give my consent to changing the agenda of the meeting to include Mr. Robert today. I asked for it to be set up till Tuesday, and that was overridden. I can't believe that was overridden on the sole discretion of the chair himself. So this is an enormous, enormous frustration for us. What I need to hear from you is that you will give us the time to have the hearings we need. I propose next Tuesday for the two clerks so that we can then get back to you with a yes or a no as to the proposed nomination. Would that be acceptable to you?
I'm not sure if I need to reiterate, but I don't. Committees are masters of their own domain. I
believe I maybe I didn't put the question quite the right way. Let me put it this way: you could give notice of motion to have his appointment through the House before you've had a favorable report back from this committee. Do you commit not to do that, not to override this committee?
Mr. Reid, I believe that everything that I've been sharing since taking this role has been in good faith. I believe knowing that we're having conversations in good faith amongst parties shows you and demonstrates that my door has always been open. And that's why I think it's important work that committee members do, and I encourage you to do that important work. When I tabled the nomination of the candidate, I tabled it with all required documents, including biographical notes. We have brought in a new process, an open, transparent, merit-based process, where the...
Forgive me, I'm not questioning the documentation you gave. I'm asking this specific question. You could introduce a motion in the House of Commons that bypasses the process here and simply causes a vote to occur without debate or amendment in the House of Commons before you rise for the summer.
Point of order, Chair.
Will you do that without having had the prior consent of this committee to that nomination?
Sorry, we have a point of order, and there's 20 seconds left. But
I believe there's a motion on the table. We still have to, as a committee, decide on that, and it would be... It's not the place of the House Leader to answer that question before the committee has even engaged in the discussion of whether that motion and whether we're having extra meetings. So it's just not relevant at this point at this juncture.
okay, well, the minister has only 20 seconds, so we'll let her use that and go on to the next questioner if she wants.
I would say that it's, we went through a process, and it's a tough position to fill because of the qualifications. We know the important work that the clerk does, and it was not an easy decision. But I do look forward to hearing about the discussion you will have with the nominated clerk following my presence.
Hey, Mr. Dubé.
Yeah, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question on the expression you used, political will. And for me, political will is necessary for the substance of changes. But what bothers us, and I'm talking on behalf of the NDP, is the process. Will you at least recognize that if there is an appearance of a lack of will, it's because we don't have a process which respects Parliament and the need for consensus, as was always the case in the past. I think I'm trying to improve the way we work together. And I did share the discussion paper. And this is why I've asked to have a conversation. And as you know, all parties' House leaders, the three parties' House leaders, engaged in conversations with us.
In omnibus bills, and this seems to be the direction that the government wants to go in, that you want to go in. And I'm a little concerned about that because if you look at C44, for example, a valid argument can be made that something like the infrastructure bank fits in a theme of the budget, but certainly when you're talking about arguably the most fundamental change in how we fund infrastructure, certainly that merits its own legislation. And so while it might fit into that omnibus bill and your vision of how that legislation should work, is that not an argument against trying to prescribe how omnibus bills are used and just simply outright getting rid of them?
Thank you. C-44 is the Budget Implementation Act that you're referring to that has gone to the Senate. We are not, when it comes to budget legislation and the definition of omnibus, budget legislation is often seen as omnibus. When it comes to the Budget Implementation Act, every measure in the BIA was in the budget. So there was nothing added to the BIA that had not already been approved by Parliament in the budget that was introduced.
Except the infrastructure bank is a completely new institution being created. And so when you're looking at how fundamental that is and the need for further study and this notion of respecting Parliament and making sure that you have the opportunity for parliamentarians to look at this and to study it in committees, which was not, unfortunately, the opportunity. Someone can get up on a 10-minute speech, a 20-minute speech, and just that piece of legislation alone warrants a speech of that length, if not more. And so when it's such a fundamental change, is there not an argument to be made that if we really want to respect that process, and because there's a spirit of things too, right? I understand this notion of trying to prescribe an appropriate way for use, but even then there would be exceptions. Is this not something that would be an exception in that case?
So I believe that, when it comes to legislation, yes, you're choosing one, but there are different pieces that are very important to Canadians in general. So where your priority might be the infrastructure bank, for another Canadian, it might be a different matter. I believe that we need to have those important conversations. I believe members of Parliament are elected to have these tough conversations. When it comes to the infrastructure bank, it was in the budget.
Great argument to have a debate on separate bills then, because some members might be more engaged on one piece of legislation, others on another one. But my time is limited, so I do want to get to another point. Just parler de la prorogation.
I'd like to talk about prorogation. Will the House have the ability to say whether or not they think the decision is a proper one? When you say that the House might adjourn, might rise, will we have a vote in the House on whether or not prorogation has been used in an appropriate way? What do you envisage as the mechanism in this case? Well, when a government prorogues, we do nothing. If there's a government that uses this option, it has to return to the House and share with all members and all Canadians the reason why they are proroguing. I think the House of Commons and all Canadians, we all work together there for them. So when the government adjourns, it shares with all members in the House the reason. So there won't be a vote. There won't be any way. It's just going to be a statement, which could be either in the House or to the media. Well, it's an idea we put forward. We've had discussions with all parties.
I mean, the essence of the title, parliamentary secretary, is that this is essentially the minister's secretary. I mean, it's an odd term to use, I suppose, but that's what it is. And so they're the people who stand in or stand up for ministers in the House. And so we could arguably say the same thing of committees, that it's not just about voting or presenting motions. Is there any recognition on your part of the fact that you essentially have someone who stands in as their job for the minister, who is nonetheless able to be present in committee and actively participate even if they can't vote?
And this is exactly why I believe part of the mandate we've been given by Canadians is to strengthen our institutions. A parliamentary secretary does not only stand in for the minister, but has access to information that would benefit members of the committee. And that's why I'm suggesting that the parliamentary secretary be able to share that information. They could be equal members of the committee but not vote and not move motions. That way they could travel with the committee so that there's information being shared with all committee members, which would, I believe, contribute to the level of discourse and decision making that takes place here. The challenge with parliamentary secretaries voting on committees is that oftentimes we see them as just the voice of the minister of the government of the day. So oftentimes there's this perception that you need to vote exactly the way the PS does, and that shouldn't be the case.
Applies also to any speaking spots they may take or their mere presence. It's not just about votes. If the parliamentary secretary is sitting there, it doesn't matter whether they vote or not. It's like the minister is there. Is that not something you can acknowledge?
Short answer, Minister.
I would say, though, that there's an opportunity to strengthen that role so that your members are able to receive more information that they might not be privy to otherwise. Parliamentary secretaries also are not just the minister's secretary, they also are the people who work with colleagues and share information. They make announcements, they do the whole 9 yards. They are privy to information that all members don't have, and this would allow and strengthen, I believe, committees to be able to have access to that information so that, and we've heard this a couple of times during this parliament, is that, the parliamentary secretary was there, they knew what the government was doing, we were wasting our time. We don't want members to waste your time. We know your time is valuable. We have important work to do here, so I believe we can strengthen that role on committees to ensure that members have access to the information they are looking for as well, if the PS has it.
Merci, Monsieur Dubé. Mr. Chan.
Thank you, Minister. I really appreciate your presence, and I simply want to put on the record that it is an honor to work with you and your entire House team moving the government's legislation forward. One of the things, and I want to follow up on some of the very early line of questioning from Mr. Dubé as it related to when you first issued your discussion paper that proposed changes to the standing order, and you raised the issue about consensus. One of the motions that was actually brought forward before this committee in response to Mr. Sim's original motion that had tried to move that discussion forward within this particular committee was the notion that all of the recognized parties actually needed unanimity for any changes to move forward in the standing orders. And I wanted your thoughts on that particular concept between the notion of consensus and unanimity, whether that is in fact appropriate, that that no changes can move forward unless all recognized political parties agree to those particular changes in the standing orders. I would find that that kind of a threshold would be exceptionally difficult to actually meet, and that would actually ossify the standing orders itself, which from my perspective is a living document that needs to evolve with practices in the reality of the House in modern times. And so I just wanted your thoughts with respect to that difference between the notion of consensus and the notion of unanimity, where I think the latter, in fact, suggests that it essentially grants a particular veto to one political party, which I think is a very high threshold to meet.
And the work that committees do is their decisions to make and move forward how they choose to. I know that we all come with various levels of experience and knowledge and perspective, so I believe in having meaningful debate. I believe in having tough debates, tough conversations. There are times where there is consensus, but that does not imply that everyone agrees. It means that we've worked together to get to where we need to get to serve in the best interest of Canadians, to ensure that the House of Commons is functioning. There is no doubt that we can improve the way we do things, and I just want to take a moment to also commend you for the work that you've been doing, and the fact that it's a pleasure to work with you, and I really appreciated your words in the House this week.
Well, thank you, Minister. I appreciate your kind comments. A large part of your opening statement dealt with the, I guess, subsequent aftermath after things sort of fell. As I said, I think there was probably a willingness to discuss substantively the aspects of the discussion paper, because even during the filibuster, much of the conversation actually centered around the issues we were trying to engage members on. The only unfortunate part was we had wanted the opportunity to bring expert witnesses, particularly from other jurisdictions, that could have helped, I think, inform this committee with respect to different ways that we could approach the operation of the House and the operation of committees. But whatever happened, whatever occurred, it subsequently occurred. What I'm more concerned about, Minister, actually, is then we subsequently moved to a discussion about the areas that we were committed to in the electoral platform, and it has been, it is your position that we have a mandate to move forward on those issues, regardless of whether there is consensus unanimity among all of the political parties, because we were elected on that particular mandate. And so, you I guess eloquently laid out the different aspects of those items: the Prime Minister's question period prorogation, estimates, omnibus bills, and the operation of committees. My question really for you really is that many of those aspects, with the exception, I think, of estimates, does not necessarily require changes to the standing orders. It can basically be done by practice and by convention. Do you have a particular view why it's important, for example, for there to be codification of these other aspects in the standing orders, like Prime Minister's question period, like prorogation, like omnibus bills, and the operation of committees, that would strengthen and improve accountability of future parliaments?
And I think you've answered the question by the end of it, in the sense that it is about future parliaments, it is about future governments. When it comes to a lot of what we're proposing, we have put into action under the leadership of our Prime Minister. But what we do need to do is ensure that any strengthening that takes place continues to take place for future governments as well, and that's why the standing orders are reviewed at the beginning of every parliament, so that we can have a fruitful debate and conversation on what's taking place, and we can improve them where there is abilities, and that they can be updated, and that is an important case. So what we are suggesting, we have to remember we were in third party when these ideas came to be, so it was really a very different perspective that being in government, and yet we continue to know that this will help all members of Parliament. This will improve the House of Commons, and it's about today and tomorrow.
Right. Well, I actually sat in that 41st Parliament, so let's just say that it was part of my living experience with respect to some of these aspects. And I have found, at least in most aspects, maybe not in the last few months, but certainly to in large part, we have, I think, tried to be far more open in terms of our approach, and to allow, I guess, more fulsome debate. I don't really have, I think, a critical question left with respect to any of the other elements, but I did want to note that, for example, this past week, the New Democratic Party, one of the opposition motions that had been tabled in the House, actually dealt with changes to the standing orders, and yet we were complaining about the fact that we shouldn't be able to move a motion to change the standing orders without consent of this particular committee. So I found there to be a little bit of a ideological disconnect that was taking place this week. But do you have any other really further thoughts that you think might change the actual approach and tone of the House? I mean, one of the other things that you ultimately subsequently did when you issued your second letter after it was clear that the filibuster would go on indefinitely if it didn't change tactics, that one of the things that you'd indicated is that we unfortunately would have to use more time allocation motions. I mean, unfortunately, that's had to take place. Those are, of course, the rules that we have at the present moment in terms of advancing the government's legislation. Is there another particular way in which we could do this without the necessity of that particular process? I'm like everyone else. I find it unfortunate that that's the mechanism that we have to use, but it's the only mechanism that the government has if there is absolutely a complete stalemate between the political parties.
Minister, you'll have to answer later. Our time is up for this round. And now we'll go to the 5-minute round with Mr. Richards.
Yeah, I just listening to Mr. Chan just now, talking about this idea that somehow the government is really focused on trying to be open and have full debate and these things, and I find that so ironic, given that following this portion of the meeting, we're about to have a very rushed process pushed on this committee, to appoint a clerk in sort of the dying days of a parliamentary session, and there'd been no consultation that took place with opposition parties prior to this decision being made, and then of course I heard my colleague Mr. Reid ask the minister, gave her a number of times opportunities to answer a question of whether she would proceed with a motion in the House without having first heard back from this committee on its thoughts on this, and getting no answer. And no commitment there at all. So it sure doesn't sound to me like a government that's open and trying to have full debate and discuss an issue. That's actually the complete opposite. But having said that, I recognize that the minister was given a number of opportunities to answer that and chose not to. So I'll maybe move to something else that I think I would like to approach the minister on and get her thoughts and comments. This past Christmas, the Prime Minister took what I would say quite charitably describe as a questionable vacation, flown by a private aircraft to an island in the Bahamas owned by...
Point of order.
Point of order.
How is this relevant to the subject that the minister is here on?
You want to defend the relevance?
If the member would allow me the opportunity to ask the questions I've got, I'm sure she'll see the relevance.
Okay, we'll go on and let's hear the relevance.
Well, I'm not certain that it's really the member's responsibility to police the content of my questions anyway. But she seems to have taken that role on herself, and I think that is a role that's rightfully with you, Mr. Chair. But this is really despite the Prime Minister's own open and accountable government rules, and I use those in quotes because I'm not so sure about them, which state that. And I'll quote this: ministers and parliamentary secretaries must not accept sponsored travel. This includes all travel, non-commercial, chartered or private aircraft for any purpose except in exceptional circumstances, without the approval of the Ethics Commissioner. Now, the Prime Minister himself has stated that he didn't consult with the Ethics Commissioner prior to that trip. And on May 15th, after months and months of questions from the opposition, an open investigation by the Ethics Commissioner as well. Finally, Kate Purchase, Director of Communications to the Prime Minister, released the following statement, and I'll quote from that as well. Effective immediately, the Prime Minister has recused himself from all matters related to the appointment of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, given the ongoing inquiry into the Prime Minister's family vacation this past Christmas. Now, in the Prime Minister's stead, Minister, you have been put responsible for all matters related to the appointment of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. At least that's what the Prime Minister expects us all to believe. But having said that, as we know, Mr. Chair, the Governor General appoints the Cabinet, which is chosen by the Prime Minister. That is, Minister, that you serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. So can you explain to us exactly, and I hope that we can do that without platitudes, how you would intend to screen yourself from the Prime Minister on choosing this appointment for the Ethics Commissioner, given that he has the sole power to be able to choose whether you remain in Cabinet or not? How can we be expected, in what world can anyone be expected to believe that he's not the one actually calling the shots?
Point of order. I think I've given a leeway so that Mr. Richards could get everything he wanted on the record, but this is not relevant. I still don't see the relevance to the standing orders. And I know we've given leeway as to the clerk appearing in this session today, but the Ethics Commissioner and the appointment of that commissioner has no relevance to today's subject matter at hand. So,
Mr. Chair, I will point out that the Commissioner does, in fact, have responsibilities under the standing orders, and that is why it's relevant to today.
Minister, there's and once again, this isn't why you were called here today, but there's a minute and a half left. If you wanted to provide any response, you could.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your statements that I feel that, are important for you to put on the record. I will remind yourself and every single member that I was elected by the good people of the riding of Waterloo. First and foremost, that is my duty, that is my responsibility, and I take it very seriously. And I think I should get the opportunity to respond because I've allowed you.
I will allow you that opportunity, Minister, but I'm going to point out that yes, you were elected by the members of people in your riding, but you were not chosen to be a member of cabinet by those people, and the Prime Minister has the sole ability to be able to appoint you to the cabinet and to be able to remove you from cabinet, and that's why that's relevant to this question. So no one doubts that you were elected, but that position is at the sole discretion of the Prime Minister. So I'll allow you to answer.
You have 30 seconds left.
I appreciate your permission to allow me to answer. But through the chair, I will definitely reiterate that different members of Parliament might have different ambitions. My primary ambition will always be to represent Canadians. We know we needed a strengthened democracy. We know we needed voices of Canadians to be heard in that place. As somebody who never thought she'd run for office, I ran for office because I knew that people like me did not have a voice in the House of Commons. The government of the day was not listening to what I had to say, and that is my commitment. That's why I wake up every morning. That's why I go to sleep. As for being chosen to be part of government and the Prime Minister giving me the opportunity to be the Minister of Small Business and Tourism as well as the government House Leader, my commitment will remain to Canadians. The very people that have sent me to this place are the people I will fight hard for every single day. And it might be tough to understand that a Prime Minister gives direction. I'm a person who has an opinion. People sacrifice their lives for me to have my opinion. I will continue to be that voice. And the Prime Minister knows me very well. And part of why I'm at the cabinet table is because he knows I will stand up for what is right, and I will debate any point that needs to be debated with anyone who wants the opportunity to do so. So thank you for the opportunity to share
I'm not
that.
sure, Mr. Chair, how that related at all to the idea of what's screened between her and the Prime Minister.
Just
But
the
anyway,
question.
I guess she tried to avoid the question the best way she could.
Time's up. Okay, we'll move on to Ms. Sahota. 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Minister, for being here today. I wanted to ask, in your opening remarks, you made some statements about wanting to improve our Parliament, wanting to improve the place that we work in. Now, I'm also, regretful, as you stated you are as well, that we weren't able to have the conversation in the appropriate manner here with experts and be able to learn from maybe perhaps other parliaments or other people that may have input as to how we can better our workplace. But I imagine, I know you put some thoughts out in your discussion paper and you've highlighted about 4 or 5 things here today, but I imagine there must be other things that are on your mind that perhaps not now, but in the future, you would like to see happen in our Parliament. So what are some of these other ways that you think we can better our workplace for Canadians?
Thank you for that question. So I shared some ideas within the discussion paper. I do believe that we can bring the House of Commons, bring Parliament into the 21st century. I do believe we need to strengthen and modernize our institutions. Because of the lack of willingness to have that conversation, I will let the committee do the work that they want to do and discover and consider ideas when that opportunity becomes available, if it becomes available. I look forward to being part of that conversation. What I do know is that we've been having good faith conversations over the last little bit in regards to what the government is proposing, the commitments we made, and it shows me that there is a willingness to want to work better together and that we can find a way to do that, and that's what I will continue to endeavor to do.
When you were appointed to this position, you must have come to it with a vision. So even if, there's not specifics that you can give at this point, I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit of what your vision for Parliament is and how you feel that members can better represent their constituents here in Parliament.
That is exactly the vision, is to be able to represent Canadians, to represent their constituents in this place. And the House becomes partisan as we are elected with political parties, political stripes, and oftentimes it becomes about the messaging of the day rather than the challenges that our constituents are facing. When we talk about diversity under the leadership of this Prime Minister, we are not just talking about visible diversity. We are talking about the diversity of our country, whether it comes to regional differences, whether it comes to industries that flourish in our communities and don't flourish, when you're talking about diversity of age and experience of how people came here and why people came here. I believe those perspectives, those experiences need to be shared in the decisions we make for Canadians so that we can better reflect them when we do pass legislation to ensure that it's good legislation. And that's what I believe we've been having is good, constructive, meaningful conversation. Can we improve it? Yes. Will I continue wanting to improve it? Yes. And I will work with everyone to do that. And even if you look at the independent, nonpartisan Senate, some people will say, well, is it tougher? Are they having good conversations and representing Canadians to ensure it's good legislation? Yes. Are they scrutinizing? Yes. That's exactly what committees do, and that's why I really value the work of committees. But we have to remember who elects us and who we're here to represent. And what I try to do is ensure that I don't only represent the people who voted for me, but represent the best interest of my entire constituency, the best interest of my stakeholders, and so forth.
Thank you.
1 minute.
Well, I'll share my time with Ms. Tassi because she had some questions as well.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Minister, to supposedly talk about the standing orders and changes. It's interesting because we spent so much time talking about that previously, and it's unfortunate that many of the questions today are straying from that topic, sort of a bit of a bait and switch. But in any event, 2 questions if I have time for them. The first is that I just want to confirm that the 5 areas that you have outlined in your presentation today were all areas which were contained in promises that we made to Canadians. So if you can just make a couple of comments about how important that is to keeping those promises that we made to Canadians.
It's when parties run in campaigns, we make commitments to Canadians, and Canadians expect us to deliver on those commitments. Things change, new information becomes available. That is always the case, and we understand that. When it comes to the commitments we have made for the, I believe, reasonable changes to the standing orders, they are commitments that I would like to see us advance. I've been having good faith conversations with leaders of the recognized opposition parties to see if we can find a way to work more collaboratively. They've been good faith conversations, and I can tell you sincerely I've appreciated them. When it comes to the 5 areas, yes, I'd like to see us deliver on them. Something I heard at the doors time and time again was Canadians saying that they wanted members in general to work better together because all of us combined actually represent the best interest of Canadians, and there's no one member that tries to do that more than others. We all work hard, there is no doubt.
Thank you. Mr. Schmale, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here and all your hard work on this file. As you said in your remarks, Canadians elected the government with a mandate to strengthen Parliament. Now, having said that, we're looking at a rushed process to appoint a potential new clerk for the House of Commons. So in this spirit of openness and transparency, were there any of your staff, any other ministerial staff, or any staff from the PMO on this search committee for this new clerk?
Once again, this isn't why you're here.
Well, I'm just
if
going
you want to answer,
remarks,
you can.
But,
I'm just okay. Go ahead.
I actually believe I've commented enough on this issue, which I'm not sure is the reason that you want me here. I will repeat and remind everyone that there is an open, transparent, merit-based appointment process. The position was posted. The qualifications and requirements for the position were available. And I'm sure as a member could understand that when it comes to this position, it's a substantial position, and there's very few people that have the expertise and knowledge that would be required for such a position. But I'm sure we all endeavor to have the rules kind of memorized and at our tips. But yeah, so there was a process. The process unfolded, and part of the process is me making a tough decision that I made. I tabled that name, and it was referred to committee, and committee will be able to do what committee needs to do.
Sure. Now, can you tell us who was on that search committee?
I do not feel that I need to share that information at this time.
Okay, we're just curious, since it's open and transparent. I'm just taking from your remarks, open and transparent. So,
I believe the witness has answered
now. I didn't talk about that at all in my opening comments.
Okay. So how do we make a judgment going forward if this candidate is the right one, if we don't have confidence in the process to get that person here?
I believe you should have confidence in the process, and I have confidence in the members of this committee to ask tough questions.
If you don't mind.
Mr. Chair, through yourself, I'll remind the member that I think he's a hardworking member. I have confidence that he will ask tough questions. I had the opportunity to meet a member of his team. She was fabulous, and I hope to be able to connect with her. And I'm sure his team only reflects his hard work, and I'm sure he will make Canadians proud with the level of questions that he asks the nominated clerk, and that's why it's important that the clerk be present.
Thank you. I appreciate those kind words, and mutual respect to you as well. But I do. There is a bit of, I guess, frustration on our side at the kind of the rush to move this forward. Can you tell us if the Speaker of the House of Commons was consulted on this decision before it was made public?
Through the chair, Mr. Chair, I think it's important that I address standing orders. I know how much time was used on this debate within this committee. I know that members were very interested on this topic, and that's why I felt that I owed it to all committee members for myself to be present, and that's why I came here with undivided attention to be available to committee members to talk about standing orders, because I really do appreciate the work that members have been doing.
And Minister, honestly, respectfully, I do too, but also the clerk and the Speaker are the
point of order. I think
orders.
We've so much repetition has gone on here. The minister's answered.
Well, Chair,
if we'd like to get back to the point of standing orders, it would be appreciated. We need to get back to the relevant matter at hand, Mr. Chair.
Well, if we're talking about standing
orders,
orders,
and the relevant matter is standing orders,
is the clerk and the Speaker,
for which we'll have an opportunity to question the clerk next.
Well,
but right now we're wasting our time on the matter at hand.
Hold it. Hold it on point of order, Ms. Tassi. And then
Mr. Chair, we're getting to the point where I feel that the witness is being badgered. Like, this point has been made. She has graciously responded to questions that are outside of the topic of today. And now the repeated questions over and over again with a response that's somewhat unsatisfactory with her response. She's been kind enough to enter into discussion and respond to questions that are far outside what we came here for today. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Chair, to redirect all members when they're asking questions from here on in to ask the questions which we came here to talk about today, which are the standing orders.
Well, sorry, there's only 2 minutes left, and we have two more speakers on the point of order, Mr. Richard and Mr. Dubé.
Mr. Chair, when I hear this idea of badgering someone, we've got members of the government trying to prevent opposition members from asking questions that are relevant to the subject matter at hand. And despite their belief, whether they're relevant or not, they're just continually, with points of order, trying to shut down questions, which are important questions, very germane to a decision that this committee has to make, and very helpful to the committee. We're unfortunately not getting responses, but there certainly is a number of questions, and Mr. Schmale is asking them in a very respectful manner. It's really quite unfortunate the government's trying to shut down and prevent that opportunity for the opposition to ask those questions.
Mr. Dubé, there's about 1 minute left for the minister's appearance.
I just want to raise quickly that this partisan fighting between these two parties has probably cut away a few minutes I would have had with the minister, and so I think that that's worth pointing out in the spirit of collegiality and wanting to make Parliament work better.
Okay. Mr. Schmale, you've got a little bit left.
Would hardly put me as the type that would badger a witness, so I don't think that's even near my personality type, and I think everyone on that side does know that. But we are in a bit of a crunch here, and we're trusted to make a decision, and there are some questions about this process that we still have some concerns about. if you could, Minister, you did actually mention it earlier. I just want to confirm: were any of the two opposition House leaders consulted on this proposed appointment?
Mr. Speaker, I sent a letter out in September asking for qualification. Mr. Chair, I sent a letter out in September asking. In all due respect, there is conversations that are taking place between House leaders and parties that I feel need to be left in the areas that they are being taken place, and I think in the best interest of all of our members, I will share that we're having good faith conversations, and I believe that we can all work together, and I think I really do appreciate having the opportunity to come here. And to Mr. Dubé's point of order, if he ever does want to grill me again, I look forward to a conversation in the lobby or anything, so I would love to answer any questions he might have.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We appreciate your appearance. I'm sure if you can have a conversation with Mr. Dubé, he would appreciate that. We'll suspend shortly while we change witnesses. Pursuant to Standing Order 111.1, subsection 1, the committee will now consider the proposed appointment of Charles Robert to the position of Clerk of the House of Commons. We have with us today the proposed appointee, Mr. Charles Robert. He is currently the interim Clerk of the Senate and Clerk of the Parliaments and Chief Legislative Services Officer. We're going to go no later than 12:45 because we have to finish our electoral reform report today in the last 15 minutes. So, Mr. Robert, if you want to make some opening comments, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm honored to be here today, and I have to confess, I'm a bit excited, but also nervous. It was on Tuesday that the Government House Leader, the Honourable Bhardat Chaggar, tabled in the House of Commons a certificate of nomination designating me to be the next Clerk of the House of Commons. Quel voyage enrichissant fut pour moi la poursuite de cet objectif.
What an enriching journey this was. This began in January last when there was a call for interest through the Canada Gazette. I put my request in before the end of February, and then I got a call. I submitted my references. I took a psychometric exam, and I was delighted to learn of my nomination this week.
It is the most senior position in my profession in this country. I am humbled, but I believe also ready to take on this enormous challenge. I believe you have a copy of my CV, but I would like to provide you with an overview of my background. I started my career, Andre will be glad to hear this, in the Library of Parliament. Worked for almost 10 years here in the House. And for the last 26 years have been working in the other chamber. The end result is that during my career, I've had the honor of working for both houses and of working for the Library of Parliament that provides an invaluable service to both. Lorsque j'ai commencé il y a plus de 37 ans,
I began 37 years ago working for the library. I developed a real interest. I was hooked on parliamentary work with its traditions, practices, and procedures. I quickly realized that there was nothing better for Canadian democracy than the Westminster parliamentary system, and I wanted to be part of it.
The House of Commons was expanding its procedural services. This was when the Table Research Branch was established here in the House. I applied for a position and was successful. I was in. I still remember the very first research paper that I wrote. It was on grievances and the history of the notion of grievances before supply. During my time in the House, I was lucky to work with some of the giants in the administration of the House, former clerks, senior clerks, principal clerks, and deputy principal clerks. It was also a time of speakers such as Jerome, Sauvé, Bosley, and Fraser. I had the good fortune to learn from all of them. It was also an exciting time to be on the Hill and working in the Commons. The Constitution was patriated, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted. There was also the then unprecedented Bells episode, delaying a vote in the House for 2 weeks. That was also the day that Bob Rae left the House. In fact, this event was the subject of my first published article that appeared in the Table. After several years in the Table research, I moved to other procedural operations, committees, and journals, and became totally immersed in the services they provide to support the work of the House of Commons. I embraced the opportunity to take on the administrative part of these jobs. Canadians, if they recognize us at all, see us sitting at the table in the House from time to time. You, however, as parliamentarians, know that more than 2/3 of the job takes place behind the scenes, in the important area of administration. Without this, none of the rest would work. In 1991, I took the opportunity to expand my knowledge and experience in our bicameral parliament and accepted a position as a committee clerk in the Senate. I thought it was a great chance to learn how the Senate, in the words of the Supreme Court, exercises its role as a complementary body to the House of Commons. From committees, I became the EA to the Clerk of the Senate, and working in his office, had the privilege of getting an important bird's-eye view of the way the entire place worked. I subsequently became a deputy principal clerk and table officer. I also assumed managerial responsibility for various procedural support services in the Senate, including journals, debates, and procedural research. Again, the sound administration of each of these areas was an important factor to the success I had in achieving my goals, building a strong team and producing positive results. While fulfilling these responsibilities, I continued to write and publish with a particular focus on parliamentary privilege. I also became involved in different outreach activities and joined some associations that promoted knowledge about Parliament and our democracy. I was involved in the initiative that established the Teachers Institute and subsequently also Many Facets. I became a member of the executive of the Canadian Study of Parliament Group and the Forum for Young Canadians. I also joined the editorial board of the Canadian Parliamentary Review. To improve knowledge of the Senate and its rules and practices, as well as to enhance the skills of Senators' staff, I led efforts to develop different tools and activities, procedural seminars, procedural notes, and after many years and too many iterations, the publication of the Senate's manual, Senate Procedure and Practice. I also worked closely with a small team of senators from the Rules Committee who rewrote and reorganized the rules of the Senate, making the text clear with a more user-friendly format. I should also mention that as a senior table officer since 1996, I was part of the clerk's management team. A big part of the job of senior table officers is providing leadership for the logistical and support functions necessary to the operations of the Senate. I was also able to realize firsthand the great importance of the responsibility that comes with coordinating and directing the activities of the different components of administration and the legislative sector so that they work together in effective collaboration to enable senators to carry out their functions as efficiently as possible. This isn't just about pushing paper. It's about setting the tone and the atmosphere necessary so that all staff can strive to improve, to be better, to always be on the lookout for ways that allow parliamentarians to fulfill their responsibilities more thoroughly and successfully. Mon implication dans la gestion de l'administration du Sénat.
My engagement in the management of administration became even more thorough following my appointment as the interim clerk of the Senate and clerk of the Parliaments in early 2015. At the same time, the Committee of Internal Economy, Budgets and Administration created the Executive Committee made up of the Clerk of the Senate and also the Chief of Ministerial Services, Corporate Services, and the Law Clerk and Chief of Precinct Services. Under this model, the three of us work closely together to direct all aspects of administration and to ensure the best service to senators.
In the Executive Committee was similar in the approach to the manner in which I have managed throughout my career. I believe that being open, inclusive, and transparent leads to collaboration, and collaboration is the only way to get the best out of everyone. One bit of advice that I received years ago when I was working as a junior procedural clerk in the House of Commons has stuck with me. Always be mindful of morale. The takeaway from that advice was that good morale is essential to effective administration. It is absolutely key to solid performance. Without the support of motivated and dedicated employees and teams, no leader, no clerk can really achieve what is required to sustain the work of the Senate or the House of Commons. Having said that, the buck stops somewhere, and that is with me. When decisions have to be made, I accept and will accept full responsibility, and if confirmed as clerk, full accountability. Finally, let me conclude with some thoughts about how I see my role as Clerk of the House of Commons, should you support the nomination and recommend that the House vote for my appointment. I am here to work for you and with you to make sure that you have the best support as parliamentarians in a modern, safe environment. The rapid pace of development of communications is transforming our appreciation of democracy and public engagement. This is already having an impact on your work as MPs representing your constituencies and legislating for the benefit of the nation. While we need to keep up with these developments and incorporate them into our models of work, we can't lose sight of the traditions that still retain their meaning, that provide an anchor for purposeful advancement. The renovations that are underway throughout much of Parliament Hill provide a good image of what I mean. These projects, updating these wonderful historic buildings, including this one, show how we can embrace the future while remembering and valuing the past. Thank you for your time. I suspect I may be ready now for some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. Very impressive background. Ms. Sahota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Robert, for being here today. Okay, well, what I'm going to start with is, for instance, when I first was put onto this committee, I thought, procedure, it can be quite boring. I wonder what parliamentary procedure is going to be like. But as a lawyer as well, I quickly had learned that if you don't know the rules of the game, no matter how good of a case you have, no matter how well-intentioned your client was or is, it doesn't really matter. You cannot effectively, defend your client, represent your client. And similarly, I've learned since being a parliamentarian that, no matter how good your intentions are to represent your constituents, if you don't know how Parliament functions and you don't know the rules, the procedural rules, you cannot be an effective representative for the people. So after looking over your CV and hearing your introductory remarks, I can see that you are a man that understands procedure very well and has, well, we've got the bells going, has a lot of experience in the past with the rules. But I'd like to get to know a little bit more about your intentions, your vision for Parliament, because there's been a lot of discussion at this committee and in general about changing the tone of Parliament, about making it more inclusive so that we better reflect and represent the population of Canada. And I would like to know your thoughts as to how you can bring your experience from the Senate into the House of Commons, because I know you've been there through an extremely unique, transformational time. What you've learned and how you've adopted to the new way that the Senate works right now with all the independent senators, and how you would apply that to the House to try to bring, that cooperative environment.
Well, the anchor, I think, for any practice followed by any parliamentary body is going to be its rules. And the rules normally have an organic history. They are created in response to circumstances that arise and develop that have meaning over time and will occasionally shift and have to be adapted or changed. Rules work with it, but rules are just rules. Their ability to actually promote the objectives of the institution depends also on goodwill. That, I think, has been true, and it was observable when I was working in the House of Commons, as I am working now in the Senate. It matters. I think all parliamentarians are motivated by the same objective of trying to achieve good for the country. And that, I think, is going to be always the driving motivation. And that will sometimes lead to friction. More often than not, we would hope that it leads to cooperation in shared objectives, because we're all here for the same reason. I've had the opportunity to speak to some members when I was briefly in Africa last year. And they were one of the 200 new members. And I thought I was living back in the 1960s, because it was really a period where you see the members are energized by their commitment and their ability to participate in something like a parliamentary environment. And I think that that's a good that should be exploited as much as possible. I know that when you at the beginning of every parliament, there is a well-programmed orientation week where you learn some of the ins and outs of parliamentary behavior. In the Senate, we know that that's not enough. We have to do more. That's why we brought into place things like procedural seminars. So we will actually invite senators' staff into the Senate chamber and explain to them and answer questions from them about various aspects of parliamentary procedure. Right now, 2 days a week in the Senate, at the end of every sitting, except this week when the sittings have gone rather long, there will be a collection of senators who will ask some of the principal clerks about the practices. Well, what happened? How did that just occur? And why was it done that way? And why did the member try to do something like pull an adjournment motion? What was there something behind it? It's trying to inform the members within the parameters that we are allowed to describe how the system works is one way that we can make you as parliamentarians more informed and I suspect also more effective.
Well, that sounds like an excellent idea. I think it would better equip a lot of the members in the House of Commons to have that knowledge, because as I sit as a parliamentarian there, there's constantly questions from all around, from your neighbors, your seatmates, from people around, and sometimes people have the answer and sometimes they don't. But I think it would be really effective to have a source that you can go to and not feel awkward about doing so. So I think that would be an excellent practice to put here. Also, there's a little bit of a difference that we were on this side of we were joking around about with the Senate versus the House of Commons as to it being televised in the House of Commons, right? And therefore, having the TV cameras in the House definitely changes the type of debate that is had from time to time, and the way the discourse gets shaped. So how would you deal with that? Because it is your job to inform the speaker and to figure out, how to bring that to decorum in the House that we've been talking and eagerly looking forward to. So what would you do in terms of that?
Well, again, I think I'd have to go back to the root answer that you have to, in some sense, inform the members to help them realize what their responsibilities are. The institution has, it is driven by a lot of partisan interest, but that is almost like an engine, but it isn't necessarily the destination. It gets you there. And I think, in fact, the idea of being more attuned to what it is you want to achieve might actually channel behavior in a different way. When I look at how things can sometimes occur in the Senate, there are certainly objectives with respect to passing legislation, and there are strategies that are in play. But the focus really is on the nature of strategies that do everything still to promote deliberation. And that, I think, is a framework that actually could influence the behavior of some of the parliamentarians in the House of Commons.
Okay, sorry. Our time for this round is up. Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Chair, and it's good to be back with the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. As Anna temporary basis, and I want to thank Monsieur Robert for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I wish we'd have a bit more time because I'd be fascinated to talk a little bit about your publications. I know I've cited a couple of them in my previous academic life, so it's good to have that academic and that publication record coming with you as well. I want to start a little bit. You talked a little bit in your opening comments about the process. You'd mentioned you applied in February. What was the application process like? Was it online? Who did you submit your?
There was. I think I have it here. In fact, it came through. I think it was something like a job opportunity. And it was posted online, and you applied online.
Very good.
And then there was a terminal date, and I made sure that I made my submission before the terminal date.
And it's always good to do it a couple of days before because you never know when the website will crash and something like that.
Well, in fact, I had to actually call PCO computer people because I was trying to enter some data, and it wouldn't accept it. So I had to actually go to PCO and say, well, make sure that that data is in because I don't want the fact that I wasn't able to properly fill in my profile to cancel the application.
And if you're using Chrome or if you're using Internet Explorer, it can always have a different effect as well. Do you recall during the interview process, during the selections process, do you recall who was on the panels when you were being interviewed?
There were people from the Privy Council office, that was for sure. There were people from the firm that was actually also managing the competition.
Anyone from the House of Commons?
I believe so.
Okay. But you don't recall who the process was? No, I recognize you've been the interim clerk in the Senate since 2015. Has the process opened up for that application yet? And
not that I'm aware of.
So what made you decide to come to the House versus the Senate?
The challenge.
The challenge? Very good. Now, I know that our current Bible, we call it, the Green Book, was last published in 2009, effectively 2008. Is that something you would commit to updating if you become the new
Certainly.
clerk? And what time frame do you think that would be?
Again, it is a massive book, and I would commit to do it as quickly but as thoroughly as possible.
Oh, absolutely. Now, you mentioned that you were notified this week that you would be the successful nominee for this position. Do you recall who notified you?
Well, the notification was in the chamber on Tuesday, and I received a call from the minister on Monday evening.
From the House Leader?
Yes.
Okay, very good. At this point, I appreciate the responses. I have about a little bit left, so I'm actually going to yield my time to Mr. Reid for the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, because of the shortened time frame for questioning this witness, we are faced with the awkward situation that it's unlikely that a Conservative MP will have the floor again. There's 7 minutes for each of the first two questioners, 7 minutes as well for the third from the Democrats, then 5 more minutes for the Liberals before it comes back to us, and that takes us past 1:45. Which is the time at which we wrap up this piece of business. This is relevant, Mr. Chair, and I know that as someone who knows the rules well, our witness, Mr. Robert, will understand the practical limitation that imposes on us. I am able to move the motion of which I gave notice earlier as long as, without 48 hours notice, as long as it is dealing directly with business now under consideration. That's under our rules for this committee adopted on January 26, 2016. 48 hours notice be required for any substantive motion to be considered by the committee unless the substantive motion relates directly to business then under consideration. So with that in mind, and because I have no other alternative, I apologize to our witness for the fact that instead of asking him questions, I'm instead moving this motion. It is literally my only opportunity to do so, since I must do so with the floor. So I therefore move that in relation to its consideration of the proposed appointment of Charles Robert to be Clerk of the House of Commons, the committee invite former Clerks of the House of Commons, Robert Marleau and Audrey O'Brien, to appear in order to gain a better understanding of the role, duties, and responsibilities of the Clerk of the House of Commons.
Thank you. Motions open to debate. Sorry. Oh, and you could speak to, we have,
I'll be try as brief as I can.
yeah. 14 minutes left on this section.
Understood. The reason for moving this is that we feel it's important to have a full discussion prior to making an appointment as important as this one. This is something that is placed in the hands of this committee so that it can carry out full discussions, and the best way of doing this is to have former incumbents of this position, of which there are two at this point, giving testimony so that we can determine the appropriateness of the government's choice. I did ask the minister earlier whether she thought this was acceptable to do. You heard her response, which sounded to me like she was saying that there was no problem. We are our own masters. It's reasonable to do that. I did ask her if she was going to override us and simply introduce a motion in the House, as she is allowed to do, should we not have come to a conclusion. She was, frankly, not clear on that, but I got the impression that she's willing to supersede us. She didn't say no, so I have to assume she meant that, yes, she's willing to do that. At any rate, one of the things that means is, while I think that would not be appropriate, the government does have that way of achieving its goal if it chooses. I wouldn't advise it, but it is a possibility. So this allows us to be better informed. It allows the House to be better informed when the decision comes for the House as a whole on this recommended appointment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to echo the comments from Mr. Reid about the importance of this fulsome analysis. We have had an acting clerk in the House of Commons now for the better part of 3 years. Our previous clerk did retire, I believe it was December of 2015, or announced her intention December 2015. So it's been a lengthy process up to this point in terms of this nomination process and the appointment process. Now we are in the dying days of this session, the dying days of before the summer recess. I know everyone is eager to return to their ridings and do the good work that has been mentioned earlier in our ridings, but I don't think it would be appropriate for us to do so without fully studying this process, studying the responsibilities and the role of this position. I think hearing from the former clerks, as Mr. Reid has mentioned in his motion, I think would be appropriate. This is a position that does not come open often, and rightfully so. I think that the clerk of the House of Commons, like the clerk in the Senate, is a position that we want to have in for a significant period of time. They are the guardian of a great deal of institutional knowledge, expertise, and a position that we want to have preserved and for a long period. So when we have the opportunity to have this appointment, I think we need to take it upon ourselves to fully examine the process, talk to the former clerks, find out from them what their experiences were, what their thoughts are on both process but on the role itself. We are going through an evolving time right now in both houses of Parliament, and have this opportunity now to have this discussion going forward. I think we need to take our time. I think we need to have the opportunity to have a full debate and discussion. I think that's why I think it's important that we vote in favor of this motion, that we have this opportunity before we rise for the summer to have this fulsome debate. I'm not going to take any more time. I'm not going to filibuster. I simply just want to have that on the record as well. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. The next two speakers on the motion, we have 10 minutes for this section of the meeting. Mr. Sims and Mr. Richards.
Well, I just in the same spirit of that, I'm not sure if that, I think as far as the qualifications are concerned, I think we all know generally what they are and how Mr. Robert can fulfill these requirements. I think this is more about his abilities and his experience, which are great, to do this job. I think the parties were consulted. The leaders have provided the qualifications by which that they want to see in a position such as the Clerk of the House of Commons. They can table that if they wish. But in the meantime, I think we should just get on with this, and I think that we should hear from Mr. Robert and see how he measures up. And I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Richards.
Well, Mr. Chair, given the comments I've just heard, if I and the last speaker, if we can bring this to a vote, I'd be happy to yield to allow there to be a vote occur on this motion.
Is that everyone agreed?
Yeah, I think
you want a recorded division?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a recorded division, Mr. Clerk.
Just give us a second to figure out which of our two members here is voting.
Okay, go ahead. We'll call you last while you decide. Call the other members.
Oh, I know I'm voting. Even though he subbed in?
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Clerk.
On the motion, Mr. Reid, Mr. Richards,
I'm in favor.
Mr. Schmale,
In favor?
Monsieur Dubé,
Wait.
Mr. Chan, no. Monsieur Graham, Ms. Sahota,
Oppose.
Mr. Sims,
Sorry, I can't hear you above Mr. Richards. Could you do that again?
Mr. Sims,
Contra against.
Ms. Tassi,
5 opposed.
Important. Okay. The motion's defeated. We still have 8 minutes left, and Mr. Reid had the floor for questioning the witness. You could still use. You had a couple minutes.
Yeah, no.
Left. A minute left, I think.
Thank you. So actually, I do want to ask. I think this is a relevant question. Your credentials, particularly your writings, are very impressive.
Thank you.
So the question I have to ask is an entirely different one, but one that I think of myself as I go from being one of the younger members of Parliament here to being one of the older ones. It happens. Yeah. Well, it's just this. Actually, how many years do you anticipate you would be? I realize no one can project their own health future, but assuming good health,
yes.
How many years do you anticipate you'd be likely to?
A good number.
A good number. Okay. All right. Yeah, we already know the answer to that question. Oh, yeah. Okay, so that, you understand, I think, the logic of asking that. So when you say a good number, forgive me, could we expect that if the 43rd Parliament is a majority Parliament and therefore it goes a full 4-year term, you'd be likely to
I fully
intend to
anticipate
serve
that I
through
would
the
be here
entire...
for at least several parliaments.
Okay, all right. That actually is...
Well, you're going to have to wait a while.
For what it's worth, I served 10 years as Deputy House Leader and never got appointed House Leader. So, having been a bridesmaid numerous times, it's a warning more to Arnold actually than to. Anyway, I'll just stop there. That was the obvious question that occurred to me. I'm actually very glad to hear that you would wind up serving us long enough that the nature of the role in which you'd be taking on inevitably would involve, among other things, being involved in the next rewrite of the book that's currently called O'Brien Bosque, formerly Marlon Montpetit, as you know. I don't think that can be done by somebody who is there for just a few years.
No, I fully appreciate that and accept that. Having been involved in writing a smaller but still major production for us in the Senate on procedure, I'm fully aware of the nature of the work involved and how much attention to detail is required. But for geeks like us, it's not actually a hardship.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Like us. Are you looking? No, he was looking at John.
Yeah.
John. For the record. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Rubin.
Monsieur Dubé.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. As two matter would be happy to have yet another McGillian in the House of Commons because we've been hearing
also
about that. Fair enough, fair enough. Selectively cherry picking here. Une de mes questions, en fait, premièrement, merci.
One of my questions, and really bravo for the roadmap, which is truly impressive. I'm not talking about privilege. I come from Quebec. I'm not, and I'll use this word carefully because I'm from Quebec, but it's about the sovereignty of Parliament. And you know that there right now is work conflict with the security officers. It's not the RCMP. How do you think we can deal with this in the future? Because the Act was adopted in the past Parliament, things have changed. Well, it has become a problematic situation because there's one way of looking at privilege. When I wrote the article on change and evolution, there's an aspect that's far more traditional, which is based on decisions handed down in 1935, and people think that privilege covers just about anything. It's decided by parliamentarians themselves. And others think that, in fact, these privileges have to have a bearing on the key operations of Parliament and not on other issues. Parliament, the House of Commons, and the Senate are entities which also have aspects that aren't necessarily parliamentary. The food supply, office design, administration. I think the answer is obvious. But with respect to protection and security, these are aspects where it's clear, but not always. Not with respect to working conditions, for example, and to the employees who provide security. Is that covered by privilege? Now, and this is a personal point of view, I believe that one must respect the standards set forth in the Charter. And this sort of thing has to be interpreted according to the values and principles that are set forth in the Charter. And that, for me, is a very important aspect. I don't mean that I don't know about restoring privilege, but I think we should renew privilege. Well, if we look at one of the files this committee has been seized with, the issue of parliamentarians traveling on Parliament Hill and their access to Parliament Hill, to the parliamentary precinct, there have been problems. And this is where the question of privilege has a bearing. Well, this is not like a traffic light. If a member is having a hard time getting on the Hill because he's dealing with a red traffic light, I don't think you would call that privilege. But if they have implemented a security system with staff and have things that happen which might inconvenience parliamentarians, well, it's unfortunate, but if there's a system that has been put in place by Parliament itself, is this truly a question of privilege? It's a question for you to deal with. It's before you. It's as I say, complex and has many elements to it. It's not up to me to provide that answer.
And I would ask everyone, we've got an important report to do if it's in camera, so if people could quickly clear the room, we don't have much time left. Thank you.
Thank you.